The Carolingian armies waged long campaigns, besieged enemy strongholds, and often triumphed through superior numbers and organization. They subdued Saxons, Lombards, Aquitanians, Bretons, Avars, Bavarians, Slavs, Frisians, and Northmen, many of whom were later absorbed into the Frankish army, the exercitus, and became part of its political structure. At its peak under Charlemagne in the early 9th century, the Carolingian Empire rivaled the Byzantines and Abbasids. Our knowledge of their military comes from Annales, Capitularies, and the letters of Einhard, Charlemagne's advisor. The Annals recount campaigns, while the Capitularies offer limited insight into recruitment and organization. Despite these sources, how the Carolingians mobilized their formidable armies remains unclear. This has sparked intense academic debate over the past decades. In this video, we'll explore the key issues in that debate and reveal the complexities behind the Carolingian military system.
Do you know why thousands of people on YouTube and Patreon support us financially? Because they get history you won't find anywhere else. We release 3 new exclusive videos every week. Plus, they get perks like early access to all videos, voting rights on upcoming series and videos, access to our private Discord, our production schedule, and much more. Right now, 250 exclusive episodes are waiting for members and patrons, including from our series on the Eastern Front of World War II, Spanish War of Succession, the Punic Wars, the Pacific War, the Iberian Reconquista, the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, Sicilian Wars between the Greeks and Carthaginians, and many others. By joining, you're not only unlocking rare content, you're also supporting the stories you love. Your help allows us to keep producing 3 free videos per week while paying our team competitive salaries and growing the channel. Join via the links in the description, the pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. Thanks for making this possible.
First, some basics. After the feudal system was dropped as an explanation for the Carolingian army in the 1990s, 3 models of Carolingian army organization developed: the Warband model, the conscription model, and the Patron client network model. All 3 models are primarily based on the same sources, but come to different conclusions due to different methodological approaches, a different understanding of the function of the sources, and different questions for the sources. One of the primary and repeatedly used sources for Carolingian military history are the aforementioned Capitularies. These are lists of decrees that were issued by Carolingian rulers that addressed various aspects of rule over the Carolingian Empire. The Capitularies address topics ranging from ideal royal estates to the duties of the clergy and military organization. The Capitularies are now seen as the remnants of the king's situational consultation with various magnates. The aim was to tackle certain problems of the realm together in consensus. The Capitularies that have survived to this day were created in various phases of this consultation process, or as instructions for royal officials, the missi dominici, who had to implement the decisions in the vastness of the empire. Thus, they were probably produced less as normative legal texts that brought innovations, but rather indicate a change in the importance of writing in Frankish governance. The aim was to put common practice into writing, to optimize it, and to create solutions for individual cases. To make matters worse, no Capitularies have survived directly. They've only survived as copies from the later 9th and especially the 10th century, in collections with various other texts, which further complicates the interpretation. The dating and mutual relationships of the Capitularies to each other are, therefore, often based on scientific assumptions and are increasingly subject to revision. These developments are crucial for understanding the various provisions related to the Frankish Carolingian military system. A number of Capitularies from the time of Charlemagne are particularly important, as they are sometimes used to formally trace the Carolingian army. In particular, the Memoratorium di exercitu Gallia Occidentali Preparando of 807 and the Capitulare missorum di exercitu promovendo, with the contested dating of 808, have been elevated by researchers to the status of crown witnesses of the Frankish Carolingian army organization. They contain, for example, the basic system that every free man was obliged to do military service, and perform his military service according to his own property. So it says here, that every liber homo, meaning free man, who has 4 mansos, a unit of land and income, either of his own or as a beneficio, a benefit, from someone else, should equip himself and join the army independently. But he who has 3 mansos of his own shall be joined to one who has 1 manse, and he shall support the latter so that he can go out for both. Men with fewer possessions were accordingly grouped together in such a way that one of them could do military service for all of them. Those who shirked their duty had to pay the penalty of the haribanus of 60 solidi. Other capitularies stipulated, for example, the equipment with which a warrior had to appear in the army, again staggered according to his possessions. The lantueri, or the defensio patriae, the idea that everyone in a region had to defend their homeland in the form of a militia, can also be found in the Capitularies. So much about the Carolingian army seems clear. There was a duty for certain groups of people to appear in the army, sanctions for those who did not fulfill this duty, and a way to recruit as many men as possible for the army and for the offense as well as for the defense. It was suggested that the basic idea of a universal service dated far back into ancient times. But why are these rules regarding the Frankish army system found in the early 9th century? The older research of the 19th and early 20th century, particularly influenced by the so-called German constitutional history and the search for the origins of the feudal system, assumed that Charlemagne was trying to distribute the burden of military service more fairly through his decrees. It was assumed at the time that all Franks were obliged to perform military service, in a long continuity that stretched back to the descriptions of Tacitus. However, as the Carolingian army changed and increasingly consisted of armoured horsemen, military service became too expensive for many freemen. In order to protect this group of freemen and to allow them to still participate in military service, as it were, the above-mentioned armament clubs were created. This form of general military service was then slowly replaced by the feudal armies of the High Middle Ages. Even so, this older concept was increasingly abandoned in the second half of the 20th century at the latest, along with the idea of an early medieval feudal system and the idea of a single Germanic identity. The anthropologically influenced ideas of the warband offered a new approach to these sources. Initiated by Timothy Reuter, it was suggested that after a century of expansion during the 8th century, the Carolingian Empire reached its borders of extension in the early 9th century under Charlemagne. These borders ultimately stretched from the Pyrenees to Thuringia, from Denmark to Benevento. However, Reuter was not referring to logistical requirements, geographical or topographical conditions. Rather, the empire's elite was no longer interested in expanding the empire. This is where Reuter's idea of the warband comes into play. According to him, the Carolingian armies were quite small but elite, following the teachings of Hans Delbruck, the father of modern military history. At their core, the Carolingian armies were aristocratic groups of mounted warriors formed around a magnate who functioned as a warlord. These groups of young warriors were held together by gifts from the warlord to his warriors, oaths, joint celebrations, and, finally, the prospect of a young warrior rising to the role of such a warrior aristocrat himself by receiving land. As the Frankish Empire expanded, a constant stream of luxury goods and booty could be poured into the gift economy and fuel the warbands. The core idea of the warband as the basis of the early medieval army was also confirmed by other researchers such as Janet Nelson or prominent Guy Halsall, and is now regarded as handbook knowledge. As the borders expanded, the priorities of the Carolingian aristocracy shifted. The distances that the exercitus had to travel to reach its enemies became longer, military service more expensive, and the spoils of war smaller. Against the background of a cost-benefit calculation, military service became uninteresting. People increasingly concentrated on the court, where they could make a career and gain power. At the same time, various groups, Norsemen, Slavs, Muslims, and Avars, threatened the borders of the Regnum Francorum. The hunters became the hunted. The aristocratic warrior groups had little interest in fending these raiders off, and lands in the threatened areas were also uninteresting to hold, as they had to be defended at great expense. In order to defend the empire, appropriate laws had to be created which obliged the people who owned land to take part in the defensive battles, and to arm more people in general. Military service therefore had to be adapted and regulated in line with the new defensive requirements of the empire. More people were to be involved in military service. Later capitularies of Louis the Pious or Charles the Bald, which repeatedly referred back to Charlemagne's instructions, would confirm this development. That said, this position is not undisputed. Other researchers point out that booty does not occur as frequently in narrative historiographical sources as Reuter suggests. Big loot, like the pagan Saxon booty at Eresburg or the Avar treasure, was not acquired every day. Luxury goods or treasures are less likely to have been the usual spoils of war rather than arms and armour or everyday objects, livestock and slaves. Guy Halsall himself now sees intangible spoils such as fame, peer recognition, and distinction through participation in campaigns as more important elements of the aristocratic self-image. Finally, the accusation is made that the ideas of a warrior aristocracy behind the warbands are based more on Tacitus's Germania or epic heroic poems such as Beowulf, rather than on Carolingian sources. The idea of a defensive change and the Carolingian army as one of mounted warriors was also criticized. These ideas of the Frankish Carolingian army were too primitive and did not meet the requirements of warfare in a post-Roman world. Mounted warbands based on booty alone would not have been able to conquer urbs, civitates or oppida that dotted the landscape, and yet it is precisely siege warfare that characterizes Carolingian warfare in the Annals. Taking up the idea of compulsory service again, a different perspective on the Carolingian army emerged, that of a strong to maximum late antique Roman continuity, which was particularly represented by Bernard S. Bachrach. According to him, the duty of the free Franks to serve in the army or to defend their own homeland was not an old Germanic duty, but an old Roman one. From the 4th and 5th centuries onwards, the emperors of late Roman antiquity had increasingly militarized their empire in a strategy of defense in depth. Large parts of the population were obliged to perform military service, or paid their taxes as labor services, or supplied soldiers from grain off the land they cultivated. Similar duties had been established among the Germanic foederati, who had settled on Roman soil and who took over the legacy of the empire and its structures in the west after the end of the Roman Empire. As a result, a Frankish military apparatus developed in the course of the early Middle Ages that presented itself as a triad. Every man was obliged to defend the Carolingian lands as part of his duty of service. These men were the general levy, who, among other things, could fulfill their duty of service by working on defensive works or infrastructure projects. Nevertheless, these men were trained and armed to defend their urbs and civitates. The men of the expeditionary levies were recruited from the mass of men obliged to do military service according to property criteria. This is where the aforementioned Capitularies come into play. There was a regulatory mechanism that had begun under the Merovingians and was only recorded and standardized in writing under Charlemagne. The men who took part in expeditions against the enemies of the Franks were selected according to the criteria of land ownership. The expeditionary levy made up the bulk of the manpower needed to carry out campaigns and sieges, as the conquest of fortified places was the main part of warfare. To the west of the Rhine there were Roman structures, and to the east and southeast there were Saxon, Slavic or Avar fortifications to conquer. Finally, the king's magnates, the counts, abbots and bishops of the Frankish Empire, and the king himself, provided troops. These men were members of the magnate's household, and were paid directly by the magnates or given land and income. Thus equipped with an income, they formed the elite core of the Carolingian army as a professional, regular, drilled group of soldiers. Depending on tactical requirements, they fought mounted or dismounted, but in all cases they were highly efficient. According to this tripartite system, researchers such as Peterson, a student of Bachrach, arrive at troop numbers approaching 145,000 men. While on campaign, these massive troop contingents were supplied from the royal estates along the most important deployment routes. where significant supplies were stored by the royal estates. During their stay abroad, the warriors had to carry 3 months' worth of provisions and equipment with them. The continuity of ancient military knowledge is also decisive for this picture of Carolingian military organization. The training of military leaders and soldiers had taken place along the lines of late antique military writings, such as Vegetius' Epitome de Re Militari, whose recommendations were put into practice while training soldiers or building military structures. This maximum position of a late antique military tradition and organization for the Carolingian army itself brings with it a number of problems. First of all, there is the idea of a universal military duty. The above-mentioned Capitularies simply do not make a point supporting this idea. As Walter Goffard pointed out, the Capitularies state quite precisely that only the free men are bound to military duty and to serve in the exercitus. He also denounced the idea of the Landwehr or Defensio Patriae as a regional militia. Here as well, it is more likely that those terms were used in the context of ways to muster the regular army in a hurry, while the realm is under attack. Even so, those who do muster are the regular members of the exercitus, while the labour work on defensive structures carried out by the lower-income freemen is also a duty that made them part of the regular exercitus. He also repeatedly argued against the idea of a select corps of household troops, as there is also no mention of them in the sources in the above depicted systematic way, as we practically know nothing of the household of Carolingian magnates, as Christoph Hack pointed out. He points to the idea of patron-client networks, and focuses on the relationship between the liberi homines and the ruler on a more local basis. Thus, he points out that the liberi homines really were a distinct social group within the Carolingian realm. While they themselves had it in common that they were above the unfree coloni, servi or villani, the group of the free man was itself quite heterogeneous. Some were wealthy inhabitants of large estates, others were poorer up to the point of owning no land at all. Many of them placed themselves under the protection or in the support of wealthier freemen. They became clients while still being free Franks or homines. The wealthier freemen, who could be a major magnate like an abbot or a count, became their seniores, meaning their leaders or their lords, without the old connotations of a liege lord. But what the free Franks, regardless of position or rank, still all had in common, and what founded their status as freemen, were their duties to the king, who regarded all the freemen as his fideles, his trusted ones, his subjects. To fulfill these military duties, as well as other services, became the basic and most often only interaction of the lower freemen with the concept of a realm and belonging to something politically larger. Thus, the patrons or seniores became the social interface with which the power of the ruling king was transmitted into the local regional sphere, where a magnate himself was the core of power, like the king was for the overall realm. When the Carolingian king tried to raise his host, he called upon his different magnates. These were the patrons of other free Franks who thus called upon their clients for their services, who followed this call on the basis of a myriad of reasons and along different local habits, be it land grants, family ties, administrative services, a job given on an estate, or that a magnate paid for the tuition of one's children. All those liberi homines flocked to their seniores to fulfill their duty in the way they were capable of and asked to, as humble cart handlers, simple spearmen, iron-clad aristocratic warriors, or as siege engineers. Assemblies like the Marsfeld were traditional starting points for some expeditions, but not consistently used. From there, the host traditionally started their expedition, still most likely supplied by royal estates and fodder that they brought along themselves. This recent model, only outlined here, can therefore be understood as a middle position between the idea of compulsory service and strong royal authority, while focusing on its local implementation and social ties between humans. We have seen in the course of this video that it is difficult to grasp the basics of the Carolingian army. The sources of the time, which are often regarded as so unambiguous, are subject to the changing interpretation of research and its concepts. The dating of sources is often uncertain, and sometimes themselves interpretations of research and thus refutable, as are the concepts with which historians look at the sources. However, a look at the local level of the Carolingian Empire, which is so difficult to grasp, and a sharper understanding of the Free Franks and their characteristics of their official duties promises further interesting results on the armies of the Carolingians. We will continue talking about the history of the Franks in the coming months, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see those videos. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.